Okay, so this particular conversation is going to go over our lymphatic system, and this is going to be the first of two conversations. So you have that first packet with you. That's going to be the one that you want to focus on, and any notes that you want to take should go on that packet. So looking at the lymphatic system, a couple of things right off the bat. Number one, a lot of people want to just refer to this as the immune system, and you can't really do that. The function of immunity is a very big part of what our lymphatic system does, but it doesn't encompass everything that the lymphatic system does. So to refer to it as the immune system, you're really cutting out some of the other big things that it carries out for our system. So we will refer to it as the lymphatic system, not the immune system. The other thing is that not a lot of people are aware of the fact that we have two vascular systems in our body. People are very aware of our cardiovascular system. They know about the heart, the blood vessels, and kind of have a good feel for how that all works within the body. But very few people realize that you have a completely different network of vessels that is going to be designed to collect fluid from all throughout the body and then channel that fluid to a place where it can ultimately be removed from your system so that you don't just continue to swell up with this fluid over time. So those two misconceptions, just kind of want to start off with. It's not the immune system because it does more than just immunity, and that it is a second vascular system that you guys have in your body that is working to remove excess fluid from your system. So if you start out by looking at that first slide, it gives you a little bit of a background. We already talked about the fact that it's going to be a series of vessels, and it's going to pull fluid from those places where it wouldn't be otherwise collected. So you'll notice the term interstitial fluid will come up as you go through the packet. And what that means is it's the fluid that is in the space between cells. And so, because it's not in the cell itself, it doesn't directly have access to a blood vessel. And so, it's not going to be moved into the blood vessel, which will ultimately run through the kidneys and it will be cleaned out of the blood at that point. So, it has to take a slightly different route in order to be pulled out of the body. And we'll talk about that more as we move through the packet. But just ultimately, this lymphatic system is looking for fluid that is building up outside of your cells and it needs to be removed from the body so that you don't continue to swell up like a water balloon. Looking at some of the other information that it provides there, it talks about having a close link to the cardiovascular system, and that is very true. Even though it's a vascular system like your cardiovascular system, it lacks one important part, and your lymphatic system does not have a working pump. So your heart is constantly pumping to move your blood forward, and the vascular system or the lymphatic system does not have anything like that. And so it will work very closely with the blood vessels, or it runs very closely to the blood vessels for two benefits. Number one, when the heart beats and forces blood through your blood vessels, those blood vessels are going to expand and contract a little bit. And that pumping action is going to press up against the lymphatic vessels that are in the area as well. And so they can play off a little bit of that pumping action from the heart to move fluid from your lymphatic vessels as well. So typically you have a blood vessel, you have a lymphatic vessel running right next door to it, and that blood vessel, as it expands and contracts, will push up against that neighboring lymphatic vessel and help move fluid forward in that way. The other benefit that your lymphatic vessels have running very close to your blood vessels is that the fluid that has been picked up, that's the point where we make that transfer to be able to get it out of the body. So any waste product that's in your cells is going to get dumped into your bloodstream. You have that connection. But again, because fluid, not all the fluid in your body is contained in a cell, it doesn't have that immediate connection to a blood vessel. And so what the lymphatic vessels do is they will collect that fluid. And now that close proximity, having your lymphatic vessels run very, very close to your blood vessels, as that lymphatic fluid is picked up, it can then diffuse from your lymphatic vessel over into the blood vessel. And now that waste product is in a place where it's eventually going to get run through the kidneys and will be filtered out through the kidneys. So it's an added step to the process just because that fluid, because of where it's located, outside of those cells doesn't have any other means to be picked up and then transported to the bloodstream without the assistance of these lymphatic vessels. If you look at that slide, it also talks about moving fats into the bloodstream. And this is something you hear so much negative about fats in your blood, in your diet, and things like that. But you do have to have a certain amount of fat in your diet. Having too much fat is not a good thing. Having too little fat is not a good thing. There are structures in your body that are dependent on fat in order to do their jobs. Some of the hormones that are built in our bodies use fat in order to be formed. And so you do need to have a certain amount of fat in your system so that everything can work the way that it's supposed to. So in this case, looking at some of the hormones, the lymphatic system is going to help regulate the amount of fat that is getting put into your bloodstream to make sure it's at the correct level so that all those other body functions can be carried out using that fat from the foods that you've put into your body. And then the last one, as I already touched on, yes, it is very much a part of your immune system, helping your body identify and then defend against bacteria, viruses, other foreign invaders that have made their way into your system. So if you look at the second slide, and I told you guys when I handed out the packets, I wanted you to have these in color. And part of the reason is for this slide. When you show this in black and white, it's hard to distinguish the difference between all of these vessels that you have, but with the color, you can kind of set them apart a little bit. So looking at the red and the blue and the purple, those are your blood vessels. The blue is going to designate the veins, the red is going to designate your arteries, and then the purple is going to be those capillaries that connect the veins and the arteries to each other. So those colors are going to indicate where you have blood vessels, and you'll notice that that's a continuous network. So it's full circle, doesn't come to an end, doesn't stop. It just always has another place to go. So we talked about your cardiovascular system being full circle. This kind of indicates that. If you look at the green structures, those are your lymphatic vessels. And green seems to be the color that most of your textbooks, references, any sites that you might look up for something, green is the go-to color for your lymphatic system. So those green vessels that you have, those would be your lymphatic vessels. And the most important thing that I want you to notice, or the two big things that I want you to notice, number one, how they do run very close to those blood vessels. So they're right next door to each other, very close proximity, allows for that diffusion, that movement of the lymph fluid from your lymphatic vessels over into your bloodstream so that they can be eliminated from the body. The other thing that I want you to notice is how the lymphatic vessels actually come to an end. You'll notice if you look at any one of those vessels, you'll eventually find a terminal point, a place where it just stops. So it's kind of like a one-way street. Now, this is important to the functioning of your lymphatic system and understanding how it works and what happens when it breaks down. The blood or the lymphatic vessels, excuse me, run head to toe. That's the direction that they move fluid from the point where it's initially pulled into your lymphatic system, and then it just starts migrating down. Now, the way it's supposed to work is that once that fluid is pulled into your lymphatic system, even though it's kind of migrating down towards your lower extremities, that it has enough time to diffuse from the lymphatic vessels over into the bloodstream so it can be removed from your system. If that doesn't happen, eventually that fluid is going to make its way to one of those terminal ends, and then it has nowhere to go. So if it hasn't diffused over because there's a breakdown in those lymphatic vessels and they're not diffusing that fluid over into your bloodstream, that fluid is just going to pool and collect in those vessels. And if you've ever seen a water balloon being filled, you know how that will continue to expand and get larger in size. That's the same thing that happens with your lymphatic vessels. If they are unable to remove that fluid, they will just hold on to that fluid. They expand like a water balloon. And you'll see this in the lower extremities. So in the feet, the ankles, the calves, you'll start to see this swelling or this collection of fluid because those lymphatic vessels are not able to get rid of that fluid that they have collected. So the last slide that you have on that first page talks about the lymphatic vessels. And the most important thing that I want you to look at from here is the fact that this is the same designation we saw in the heart. This is the same setup that we see in the blood vessels. And now we're seeing it again in the lymphatic vessels. 3 layers. You have an inner layer, you have an outer layer, and then sandwiched in between those two is that muscular layer. And I told you guys last week, this is going to be a common theme. You'll see this again as we move forward into other chapters, that a lot of our internal structures have 3 layers. You have an inner and an outer layer, and then you have that muscular layer that's going to be in between the other two. So that's what that slide is referencing there. The next slide that you have is the lymph fluid. And with the lymph fluid, this is a collection of any fluid that's in your body that's not supposed to be there and was contained or typically outside of your cells. You can pick up this fluid from a lot of different ways. You can actually leach it in through your skin. So if you're cleaning and you've got your hands in cleaning products, you're not wearing gloves, that can leach in through your skin. If you're one of those people that likes to write notes to yourself on your hands so you don't forget to do something, that can leach into your skin. The foods that you eat, and when you force your body to do work, some of the waste product that is created through doing that work. All of those are sources of this fluid that can build up in your system and ultimately has to be eliminated. Your lymph will vary from day to day because you come in contact with different things on different days. You eat differently from one day to the next. And so when you start combining that, lymph is something that will transition and, like I said, be different from one day to the next. But as that material gets into your system, so your waste product or came in through your skin, however it got into your body, it's now sitting in between the cells. It has nowhere to go. The lymphatic vessels are going to come through and start pulling all of that fluid from all those places and then just combining it into one. So when you take all of that material and collect it into those lymphatic vessels, that fluid that is a result is going to be called lymph. If you move down to the middle slide, it talks about lymph function. And lymph function, and this is starting to move into a little bit of the lymph nodes. So if you think about your lymphatic vessels, every so often they are going to have a lymph node attached to them. And I'm jumping ahead just a touch, but the lymph node is going to be kind of a checkpoint. So the lymphatic vessels are transporting this lymph fluid, and then every so often you have a lymph node on the lymphatic vessel. The lymph fluid gets pushed through that, and the lymph node will kind of check it out, and they will detect if there's anything there that's not supposed to be there. If they find something that's not supposed to be there, they'll hang on to it so that it doesn't continue to circulate through your body. So that's part of just collecting this lymph. If there is anything in your system that's not supposed to be there, it typically will get pulled in with that lymph as well. And so your body will monitor the makeup of the lymph fluid to make sure that you don't have bacteria or viruses or anything like that in your system. We already talked about the fats, taking the fats from the foods that you have eaten and then making sure that they are getting delivered over to the bloodstream. We talked about picking up the extra fluid and getting that all taken care of. And then the fact that that fluid will get run through those lymph nodes every so often, so the lymph nodes can pull out any foreign particles, anything that it doesn't recognize or that was not made by your body, and contain it so that it's not circulating and coming in contact with any other body parts, any other cells than what it absolutely needs to. The last slide on page 2 talks about how lymph moves, and it has to be very creative. As I already mentioned, it doesn't have a pump to move it forward, so it has to find another way to make sure that that fluid is moving in one direction. And so the close proximity to the blood vessels will work. Also muscle action. So again, any moving body part that you guys have, your lymphatic vessels can kind of play off of that and use that in order to move the fluid forward. So when you guys get up, your muscles are contracting and relaxing as you carry out different movements. That's going to apply pressure to the lymphatic vessels that are in that area and can help move lymph fluid forward. Respiratory movements. Again, lungs expanding and contracting are going to push on those lymphatic vessels and help move fluid in a direction, in a forward direction. And then your lymphatic vessels are also going to contain valves very close to what you have in the heart. And those valves just ensure that once the fluid has moved past a certain point, that it's not allowed to move backwards. And so then again, always keeping it moving in one direction. If you move over to page 3, on page 3, it starts to talk about lymph nodes. I know that I already touched on this a little bit. Lymph nodes are filters. That's really how you have to think about them. And so every so often along the lymphatic vessel, you're going to have this filter in place that is going to clean out that lymph fluid. Now, the average person is going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 700 lymph nodes in their body. They are found all the way throughout from head to toe. But there are some areas where you have a higher collection or clusters of the lymph nodes, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So the lymph nodes, as I mentioned, are from head to toe. And the reason that you need them all over the place is because even though we have the obvious points of entry for bacteria viruses, like the nose and the mouth, because they're openings to the outside world, you also never know where you're going to have an injury that's going to open up another path. So if you cut yourself, you get a scrape, you've cut the skin or torn the skin, now you've created another entry point for foreign invaders to be able to get into your system. So you need to have lymph nodes all throughout your system instead of just in those places that are open to the outside world naturally. So when we look at the lymph nodes, 3 places in the body where you have the highest number or the clusters are going to be in the neck, are going to be in the armpits, and then are going to be in the groin region. And the reason that we have the high number in those 3 places is number one in the neck, because if you think about it, you have the ears, you have the nose, you have the mouth, where things are able to enter the body, and it's just an easy point of entry for things to come in. You touch stuff with your hands, don't think twice about then grabbing food and putting that into your mouth. You have no idea what you've been touching necessarily. And so, because of the availability of those openings offering easy access for bacteria and things like that, we have those cluster of lymph nodes in the neck. And because of what those lymph nodes do, they filter out the lymph fluid and they hang on to anything that is not supposed to be in your system. Well, when they hang on to that and you have a lot of something that is not supposed to be in your system, so let's say you have an infection, all these bacteria are in your system. Well, there's going to be a high number of bacteria that need to be pulled out of that lymph fluid and then contained in those lymph nodes. Well, as you start jam packing those bacteria into those lymph nodes, eventually they're going to start to swell up and they can get very hard and feel like little rocks underneath your skin. But that's the reason why you see that transition or that change in the lymph nodes, is because they are hanging on to everything that's not supposed to be in your system. In the armpit, now we don't have any natural openings to the outside world in the armpit, but what we do have is we have a natural breeding ground for bacteria. Most of us spend most of the day with our arms down by the sides or down by our sides. So we're going to have an area that's usually warm, it's usually dark, and it's usually a little bit on the moist side or wet. And because of that, you've created an area where bacteria are going to thrive and do very well. And so that's another place where we're going to have a high collection of those lymph nodes, just to make sure that your body is staying ahead of it in case for some reason there would be a point of entry, um, that you have those cluster of lymph nodes to deal with anything that might be trying to get into your system. And then in the groin, we're back to a place where we naturally have openings to the outside world. In the female body, you have 3 openings. In the male body, you have 2 openings. And so another high cluster of lymph nodes in that area to deal with anything that might be coming in. The middle slide that you have on page 3 just talks about the location of the lymph nodes. You can see the lymphatic vessels running from head to toe. I wish they had done a better job of showing lymph nodes from head to toe. They kind of cut it off at the waist, but just to give you a little bit of a visual. So if you are more of a visual person, kind of shows you the layout of the structures of the lymphatic system. The bottom of page 3 talks about the job of lymph nodes. And like I said, I know I already kind of jumped ahead and talked about this, but it just ties into some of the other information as well. So I pulled it in a little early, but that just kind of reinforces what I was talking about earlier. They filter out material that's not supposed to be there. They hang on to it so that it can't continue to circulate through your system and do any harm or damage. If you look at the last page, page 4, It talks about the thymus gland and the spleen and some touches on autoimmune diseases. Now, one thing that I would like you to write down is we've talked about the major structures of the lymphatic system. So we have the lymphatic vessels, the lymph nodes. Those are three of the big ones. We also have these two, the thymus and the spleen, but I want you to mark down bone marrow as well. All of your blood cells, whether they are red blood cells or white blood cells, are going to start in the bone marrow. And they are going to reach a certain point of maturation, and then they will leave the bone marrow and they will go out to other places in the body to be used. So bone marrow is a huge part of the lymphatic system just because it's the origination site for your white blood cells, which are going to be your defenders when we get into talking about immunity. Now, the thymus gland is an interesting gland because it's one of the few structures in our body that actually will get smaller with age. And typically when we talk about growth and development, as you get larger, your internal structures increase in size as well. And with thymus gland, that's not the case. It actually does the reverse. So the thymus gland is tucked right behind your sternum. So if you tap on your sternum, the thymus is going to be right back there. And as a child, it's very large. As you become an adult, it will get smaller. And if you live long enough, it will completely disappear. Here's the reason why. The thymus gland is supposed to train a group of white blood cells called your T cells. And they're called T cells because they spend most of their life in the thymus. So T from thymus, T cells. Now, what the thymus actually does is when you come across a particular infection, bacteria, virus, whatever it might be, your thymus gland will send out an army of these T cells, and the T cells will go and learn what they can about this foreign invader, learn how to defend it, learn how to fight it off, and they just pick up any information that they can about the foreign invader. And then you have this group of T cells, and they are designed to fight off one infection and one infection only. And they will stay with you. And the next time that you encounter that same bacteria or that same virus, you now already have those cells in place that know exactly how to deal with it. They take care of it before you even know you came in contact with it. You're not going to feel the effects of it or get the symptoms of it or anything like that. So when we get vaccinations for mumps, measles, rubella, things like that, they actually give you a little bit of those viruses so that those T cells can go out, learn what they can about those viruses. You build up this cluster of T cells that knows exactly how to defend against the measles or the mumps or polio or rubella or whatever it is. And so because you have those specifically trained cells, it makes you much more efficient at identifying something as soon as it gets into your system so that it doesn't have the chance to grow and multiply in number and actually make you sick. Now, what happens is as you age, most of us spend our entire lives in the same place. And I don't mean necessarily the same state, but you might move from Iowa to California or Iowa to New York or something like that. Most of us don't pick up and move to Africa, or most of us don't pick up and move to South America. And so by the time we start hitting our 50s, and even probably before that, we're not coming in contact with any new illnesses. We're not coming in contact with anything that our body doesn't recognize. And for that reason, the thymus kind of becomes obsolete, and the human body does not keep anything that is not efficient. So, as it has fewer and fewer T cells to train, it starts to get smaller and smaller. Your body actually will reabsorb it. Like I said, if you live long enough, you will completely reabsorb your thymus gland, and it's actually replaced by a little pocket of fat that is behind the sternum. So, thymus, like I said, very interesting in the fact that it does something that we really don't see in any of our other body structures. After that, we have the spleen. The spleen is one of the three major filters of the human body. We have the liver, we have the kidneys, and we have the spleen. Now, the liver is going to deal with more toxic material. The kidneys typically deal with waste product. When we look at the spleen is a structure that is going to help filter out those foreign bodies, those foreign particles that don't belong there. They also can help trigger an immune response depending on what's going on in the body. So the spleen is actually going to be located on the same side as your stomach and your pancreas, kind of tucked in that same little space. And because it is cleaning the blood, so its kidneys are cleaning the blood as well, but they're looking for that waste product. Spleen is looking for foreign bodies and cleaning that material out. But it is very highly vascular, and so if you do damage to the spleen, it's very easy. You get a lot of bleeding just because of the number of blood vessels that are going in and out of that spleen. So sometimes when you have damage to the spleen, it's just easier to remove it because that's the fastest way they can stop the bleeding and keep you from bleeding out. The last line that you have on page 4 talks about autoimmune diseases. Now, autoimmune is a situation where the body loses the ability to recognize its own cells. We talked about in our cell chapter how the surface of the cell has these little carbohydrate flags that are basically used for recognition, so that as your cells are moving through your system, your body recognizes that carbohydrate flag, knows that it's something that you made and that it's okay to be there. These foreign invaders, they'll have a carbohydrate flag, but it's different, and your body doesn't recognize it. And that's the alert that something is in your system that doesn't belong there. Well, in the case of an autoimmune disorder, for some reason, your body will lose the ability to recognize the carbohydrate flag on a certain group of cells. So in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, somebody would lose the ability to recognize their own cartilage cells, and they will start to attack and get rid of their own cartilage. In the case of HIV and AIDS, the body loses the ability to recognize its T cells, the ones I was just talking about. Well, those T cells are designed to fight off infection. If your body doesn't recognize those cells anymore and starts killing them and attacking them, eventually it wipes out your T cells and your library of these defenders that are supposed to keep you safe and protect you. So people that have AIDS typically die of things like the chicken pox because even though it's something they might have had and initially had immunity to it at some point in their life, once those T cells were wiped out, their body could not recognize that infection any longer. They had no idea how to defend their system against it, and it eventually overtook their immune system or their lymphatic system. So that's just a brief rundown of this initial part of the lymphatic system. Um, we are going to spend more time talking about the cells. So we'll get into the white blood cells, the different types of white blood cells, a little bit more on the immunity side of things, just because that is such a big piece of this. And talking a little bit more about how your body works to identify things once they get in your system and then rid them out of your body. So bring your notes with you next time that we come to class. I'm going to ask you to obviously watch this video, take your notes, study your muscles. You have both of your muscle packets back. You will have an activity on June 8th in which you will not have your muscle packets for certain parts of it. So the more that you know, the better off you're going to be in that activity. So make sure that you are studying those muscle packets and then also check Blackboard for your assignment.